is a very exciting event and the last public event of Virtual ASN's first season, which we began last year with a panel on nationalism and the pandemic. And I believe it's fitting that we are closing it with this exciting roundtable discussion about turbulent elections. I'd like to thank the panelists and the organizers, Julie George and Myra Waterbury, who are on the leadership team of Virtual ASN. I'm not going to take up much of your time. Just want to say that I think it's fitting that we end our first season with a panel about elections, which are usually imagined as the beginning of something, a basic necessity of democracy and definitely of democratization. But of course, elections are raising all sorts of difficult questions today. And those questions, many of those questions will be discussed today. I'd like to just very briefly introduce the four scholars who don't really need an introduction. We are very happy that they agreed to be part of this conversation. Their work has made a real difference in this field of democratic and autocratic politics, working primarily what used to be the region of Soviet-style communism, and we don't really know what to think of it or how to think of it anymore. I will introduce them very briefly here. You will see their short bios posted in the chat. So our expert moderator is Lucan Wei, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. And his work on competitive authoritarianism has, of course, been immensely influential. I'm also going to flag his most recent book with Stephen Levitsky, forthcoming with Princeton University Press, which is titled Social Revolution and Authoritarian Durability in the Modern World. He will lead the conversation among and with the three other experts, Lenka Bushtikova, who is associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, also editor of East European Politics. Her work on party politics, voting behavior, state capacity has received multiple prestigious awards. I'm going to flag the most current one, the Davis Center Book Prize in Political and Social Studies for her 2020 book titled Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, came out with Cambridge University Press. Anna Gimarabusa is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor in the Department of Political Science, Director of the Europe Center and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. That was a mouthful. And of course, her work has also been pushing the boundaries and inspiring new research about party politics, politics and religion. You'll see her short bio in the chat. I'll only add that my students love her book titles. And Kevin Deegan-Krause, professor of political science at Wayne State University, one of the best known experts of party politics, new parties, especially exciting new field elections in Central and Eastern Europe. And I will just flag his new book, The New Party Challenge, Cycles of Party Birth and Death in Central Europe and Beyond, which he co-authored with Tim Houghton and is coming or has come out recently from Oxford University Press. And I am going to now turn it over to our moderator, Lucan Wei.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Thank you, and very much to the organizers of ASN for inviting me, and to Julie George and others who have made this possible. So not too long ago, when I was an undergraduate and graduate student, elections were primarily a source of hope. You had Poland in 1989, Hungary in 1990, South Africa in 1994, were all sort of began eras of increased democracy and represented the end of autocracies. And it really kind of, a lot of these events, we still remember where we were, some of us, and they brought a real sense of euphoria, right? So to put it mildly, elections more recently are a lot more fraught and bring anything but euphoria. I don't know, but I'm probably not the only one who was thrown into depression by the 2016 election and basically couldn't sleep the entire fall of 2020. And what we've been reminded of in the last 2 decades is elections can facilitate greater democracy, but they can also bring to power autocrats. So elections in Venezuela, basically in 1998, brought an end to democracy there. Elections in Hungary and India have basically augured in a new era of competitive authoritarianism in countries that were once well-established democracies. And finally, the United States, so the 2016 election did not destroy democracy, but it certainly has thrown American democracy under question. So the question is where we are today. And as I see it, we sort of see kind of mixed trends. I mean, at one level, we have more positive for democracy outcomes in the United States and Israel, but we also see less positive outcomes, in Hungary in 2018 and Slovenia. Benin, for those of you who follow Beninian politics, the April election saw the re-election of the dictator Patrice Talon. So the question is, so today I want to kind of address 3 questions. First, what is the status of democracy today? Where is it going? Since 2008, we've seen sort of incredible dysfunction in the West, beginning with the financial crisis, Brexit, and then we also saw, of course, in 2016, for the first time in modern history, an American president who actively favored dictatorship. So, how have we survived how has democracy survived the last 4 years? Are things better or worse than we might have expected? Second, what is the impact of elections on all of this and electoral outcomes? So sometimes it seems like the fate of humankind depends on what a few working class voters, how a few working class voters vote in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But are things as contingent as that, or elections that meaningful? And finally, if we have time, I want to talk about sort of how the pandemic fits into this. I think there's an argument that the pandemic has sort of potentially helps democracy, but also undermines it. And today we, as Zsuzsa mentioned, we have 3 wonderful experts with us. They're all experts in party politics and democracy, and she's already provided the introduction, but I think I'll get it started and maybe start with you, Anna, and so maybe you could talk about where you see the state of democracy now.
Well, I think what's worrying is that it's the consolidated democracies that have begun to erode, right? I mean, the sort of wobbly democracies remain wobbly, competitive authoritarianism remains fairly stable. But what I think it's really worrying is the fact that you have places like the United States, India, Israel, Poland, Hungary, which were often thought of as relatively consolidated, now being the places where formal institutions are being attacked, and worse yet, the informal norms of democracy are regularly being ignored, right? And so this kind of mistreatment and dismissal of the opposition, the attacks on the media, the creation of the delegitimation of the most fundamental institution of all, elections, in both Israel and the United States, I think are deeply worrying. And they're deeply worrying not just because they affect those countries directly, but because they have long-term effects abroad as well. These are countries that are usually held up as the paragons of democracy, and now they're basically eroding themselves.
That's great, thanks. Maybe Lenka, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on some of Anna's points, I think if we looked at some recent scores, let's say the VDEM or the Freedom House, we see that in the big picture of things, democracies are fine, but the overall trend is downward, and that perhaps says something about the scores themselves. But I think we intuitively feel that there is something bubbling sort of underground, and I would sort of under the surface, and I would sort of add to what Anna was just saying. I think there is ongoing battle between at the ground level among the civic groups and uncivic groups, between those who advocate for voter access, free elections, liberal democracy, but we also see a coordinated, very sophisticated search of the global socially conservative civil society that cuts across democracies and autocracy it evolves around gender rights, LGBT rights, but it has also implications for electoral contestation because it goes hand in hand with intimidation of minorities. We see a global surge in attacks on religious and ethnic minorities that has implications for elections. Suddenly, unfortunately, Donald Trump's great achievement is that free and fair elections is now a contested concept. So I greet you from Arizona, where, as you probably know, we have this, fake recount, which of course has nothing to do with getting to the bottom of things, but really to inject more uncertainty and as a sort of template of how elections can be labeled as sort of as rigged. And I think one thing I would add, and it goes also with sort of understanding consolidated democracies, which is we also see a surge in violent forms of uncivil society activism. Of course, we have seen it on January 6th in the United States. We have seen storming of the parliament in Germany, in Denmark, attacks on governmental offices. And in my view, this is a very dangerous development because, it's just not these attacks, but here goes the sort of possibility of voter intimidation and voter suppression. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here, of course.
It's great. So, so Kevin, I think not only is he an expert in party politics, but he's really basically on the front lines right now. He's reporting from Armenia.
That's right. I feel like I'm in the Eurovision Song Contest, and this is
Exactly.
Yerevan calling.
But anyways, so how are things on the ground, Kevin?
So I've actually just come. It's 9 p.m. here in Yerevan, and I've just come from wandering around the city, full of election rallies, including one by the ballot group number 3, the civil contract, which was full of people, full of a lot of pyrotechnics, a lot of drones, really kind of unusual phenomena that we wouldn't have expected to see or even thought to exist a while ago. And we haven't really gotten into the thick of the elections, but I mean, what we've seen, just here in Armenia, is akin to, I think, a lot of the stuff that we've been seeing elsewhere, which is, sometimes it's hard to say whether democracy has gotten, better or worse. I tend to agree with Anna and Lenka that it seems to be getting slightly worse, but I think more than anything, it's becoming weird. The institutions are changing. The frameworks in which parties are competing with one another are different than they used to be. The technologies and the methods by which they organize open space for things good and bad, where there might not have been space or breakthrough before. I've been making a series of party maps of political parties in Western European countries, Eastern European countries, and for a lot of those countries during the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there are these long periods of stability where the actors are the same, their rough ideological positions are the same, their alliances are fairly predictable. And then even in those countries, not just in the countries that we study, but even in those countries, something happens in the 90s, especially in the 2000s and the 2010s, that those institutional structures seem to fragment, break apart, recombine in new ways. And I think that lets in some of that space for deconsolidation of consolidated democracies, maybe sometimes also space for attacks on consolidating autocracies, which is good news. But I think the landscape is changing, and that's, I think, for me, the most fascinating part.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to insert myself here. I actually want to present a somewhat contrarian point of view. I certainly am as concerned as anyone about the fate of democracy, particularly in the United States, which I think is I'm sure, the most shocking to anyone who grew up assuming that the United States was democratic, and that was never under question. And certainly, I think it is quite true that, for example, if Trump had won in 2020, I think there's it's very plausible to see how the United States could have been transformed into not to a full autocracy, but to a competitive authoritarian regime. At the same time, I think there's sort of, my own view is that the picture of the state of democracy has not been sufficiently nuanced in commentary, that, reading the press and stuff, you might think that we're sort of, for example, in a period not too long ago, like the 1970s, when there are far more closed autocracies in the world than, even any kind of electoral regime. So I just want to share with you a figure. Let's see, here. This is from VDEM. This shows the total number of electoral and liberal democracies in the world. Now this, and many of these democracies, like the United States, which are still counted as liberal, are in crisis. And it's also true that if you do it per capita, which includes big countries like India, which has recently seen a genuine decline, then that figure goes down. But still, even in our per capita level, right now, as we speak, about 50% of the globe lives either in a liberal or electoral democracy. There are about 3 times fewer closed autocracies as there were not too long ago in sort of my adult life, in the 1980s, right? And despite the fact that basically what you've seen in the last decade is a dramatically worsening international environment. So in the 1990s, that you had liberal hegemony, you had sort of, China and Russia were in retreat. The EU was sort of at its height in terms of attractiveness. But since the late 2000s, you've seen attacks on all fronts. Russia and China are much more aggressive than they were. You've seen an enormous, unprecedented dysfunction, in the West, with Brexit, with the Eurozone debt crisis. And most shockingly, you've seen, the emergence of a president who actively supports dictatorship, right? And so given the importance, as Anna mentioned, of the West in, historically, the European Union in promoting democracy, you might have expected a much more dramatic decline. But the truth is that, things might get worse, and I certainly would not bet a lot of money on things remaining relatively okay. But right now, as we speak, what I see, this is sort of a Rorschach test, right? You look at it, what do you see? I'm interested in the audience, what do they see out of that? I see both signs for concern, but also surprising resilience of democracy or something very close to it in countries where you would not normally expect it. These are like places like Bolivia, Ecuador, Mongolia, Armenia. I guess, Kevin can tell us whether that still is optimistic as we might thought. Ghana, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Namibia, Romania, and the like. So I think, I guess what I want to inject is sort of this is actually a more complicated story than I think has been told so far. But does anybody else want to come in on this, or think that I'm sort of rosy-eyed and I've been drinking too much wine that my wife gave me for my birthday, or what?
Yeah, I do think this is a bit too rosy-eyed, or you may have had too much wine. But I think what a lot of this being missed is a lot of the ratings that I'm familiar with focus mostly on the formal institutions. And if you squint, these are perfectly functioning democracies, but it's the informal institutions that I think are being taken apart. These sort of, simple norms that Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt talk about, sort of, forbearance and mutual toleration. And that's where a lot of the action is. If you look at, again, sort of, the consolidated democracy, United States, Israel, India, Poland, Hungary, those are the norms that are being taken apart. So the media is fake news. The formal institutions are delegitimated and seen as these creatures of corrupt elites and have to be sort of redone from the bottom up. And the opposition, above all, the opposition is regularly denounced as not being real Americans, as being traitorous, as being somehow not real Hungarians, and they are basically actively marginalized rather than tolerated and respected the way we would in a democracy. So the formal institutions don't look that different. But the kind of discourse that we see and the kind of delegitimation that the elites are pursuing is still there. And so I worry that this very sort of rosy image of the number of liberal democracies may be missing out on how the character of democracy has changed. free elections are still being held. But the kind of claims that are being made about those elections and about the opponents in those elections have definitely changed.
I guess so. If anybody else wants to break in, otherwise I'm just gonna. I don't want to make this a Luke and Anna show. Kevin, or I think that's a little unfair to call it formal. I mean, I sort of, places like the VDAM. I mean, they don't simply look at constitutions. I mean, if it were simply formal institutions, they would call Uzbekistan a democracy. They don't, or Russia. But I think in these places where we're still, even if I agree with you on the quality of democracy, but to me it still matters that elections for a lot, of countries, roughly half, they are the main center of where power is contested. And I guess part of my reaction is I don't think that's something that should be taken for granted. That wasn't the case when you and I were kids, Anna, right? I mean, so.
Back when mastodons roamed the earth and the
Oh, this is not, we're not that old, God.
Back when Italy just got unified.
Oh, seriously, I mean, we're not talking about ancient history here. We're talking about, when both of us could legally drink, right? So, we haven't even come, I guess my point is that things, there's definitely concern. There's a reason why all of us at least I didn't get sleep in the fall of 2020. And things could get a lot worse. But so far, I mean, I think it's important to both look at where we think things are heading, but also where they actually are right now empirically. And so far, democracy, most places, certainly not in Hungary. I don't know what you think about whether democracy has died in Poland, Anna, but that would seem plausible. But for much of the world, democracy or something very close to it is still running. I mean, we need to understand and why that is in the face of tremendous international headwinds. I certainly, at the end of Competitive Authoritarianism, which I wrote with Steve Levitsky in 2010, we predicted wrongly that with the end of liberal hegemony, you would see a decline in competitive authoritarianism, a decline in regimes and where elections are the primary means of gaining and keeping power. So I just don't see that.
So I just, would like to, I also think it's sort of worse than it looks. I recently tried to write I agree with sort of you that I tried to write a paper about pandemic backsliding. I look at the scores and I'm thinking, what backsliding? So on the surface, things might look decent, but to add sort of, to Anna, it's not just only about like a lack of forbearance and informal institutions, but I really think it creeps down to issues of personal safety. So for example, in Arizona, the electoral officials are getting death threats. There are gangs, there are sort of groups of people with weapons in front of her house. And so this, again, I'm not a scholar of American politics, but I think this is really a turning point. So there is an issue of physical safety for various minorities. Of course, minorities in all consolidated democracies will tell you, welcome to the club. But I have a sense that that there is a big expansion of targets, which now includes political opposition, not just in the case of discourse and forbearance, but also in terms of not feeling safe as a person, maybe not even feeling safe as an academic. And social media greatly adds to it. There are academics, a lot of female academics in Europe who study far right, who are targeted by social media. And then there are members of the LGBTQ in Poland. Recently there was an article in New York Times who want to move out. So again, not that attacks on minorities and consolidated democracies haven't been seen before, but I sort of, I don't have a good empirical handle on it, but I do smell that there's just something really different in the air right now. And maybe this is very specific to the United States, but I have a sense that sort of this issue of really escalating the fight, it's a fight about values, and this is really a battle, and more things are permissible now. And that goes to the issue of breaking informal rules, but they have really serious implications for physical safety of political adversaries.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point. And sort of the violence is now part of American politics, which it hasn't been for close to 100 years. I want to sort of then go into the audience. They have some questions. I mean, I think we all agree that even I, a rosy-eyed Lucan Way, agree that sort of level of democracy has declined in the 2010s. So maybe sort of I could get some of you to sort of comment on what you see driving this trend, recent decrease. Start with Anna, or Kevin, you haven't had a chance to come in if you want to come in. Or
yeah, again, I mean it is a decrease, but I think it's not a uniform decrease. I mean, I think autocracy took a savage hit in the 80s, and so maybe it's not that inexplicable that democracy might take a hit later on. It is interesting that a lot of countries, I mean, even the countries that most of us studied, I think if you'd asked us back when mastodons roamed the earth, if these transitions would consolidate, what percentage of, say, the 10, 11 countries now in the EU would still be democracies? If you asked us in the 90s and we said, oh, there'd be 9, I think we'd be pretty excited, and we'd probably be surprised that the 2 outliers were Poland and Hungary. But that's actually a moderately good track record, and that we see a bunch of emerging democracies in places where we might not have expected it. I think that is excellent news. And I think it's dampened a little bit by the fact that we see countries, as you said, that are, we thought were consolidated, but aren't. But it seems like neither of the consolidated forms that existed in the 80s and the 70s, way back then, are as consolidated as they were before. But you asked about drivers. I mean, I think in an age of fundamental transformation of a media and organization, electronically mediated, I think in a change of human identity, we're seeing the kind of next generation of de-alignment, the next generation of increases in political distrust. I think to expect that we would see a kind of unidirectional set of trends in either way, toward or against autocracy, would be pretty unlikely. I think what we're seeing is multiple different winds, blowing in contrary directions, so that some things are getting remarkably better, and other things are getting worse at the same time. So I think we need to disaggregate to the smaller stuff. I mean, LGBT populations are being marginalized and attacked by sort of fringe right-wing groups, sometimes by governments. But the position of the LGBT community is radically different than it was just 20 years ago, even in the region that we study. And so, I think it's just a lot more arrows pointing in a lot of ways. I looked up the etymology of the word tumultuous. My students are tired of me looking up etymologies, but it comes from the Proto-Indo-European, which means grow or swell, and it's the same root as the word for thousand and tumor and tuberculosis. And I just get this image, this kind of constant growth of multiple different trends and changes that are much harder for us to get a handle on.
Okay, I want to turn it to you, Anna. You've written that part of the reason for the decline, for the rise of populism, has to do with the sort of weakness and dysfunction of established parties, right? And could you talk a little bit about that, but also talk about sort of what's been driving the weakness of establishment parties? Are they just, was the center left just stupid, or what's been driving this?
I think, well, so in Europe, at least, both the center left and the center right have been under enormous pressure, right? And in the case of the center left, it's how to protect the welfare state from fraying even further. In the case of the center right, it's how to contain far right disappointment and far right grievances. And both of them have done a pretty spectacularly poor job of this. And I'm not saying that they could have done a better job necessarily, given some the pressure of these forces. But I think issues such as immigration are sort of ideally positioned to both sort of attack the center left and the center right, because the center left has to answer the charge that these immigrants are now going to fray even further this fragile net of the welfare state, and the center right has to say, well, how are we going to protect this true national character of our respective nations without delving into xenophobia? And so on issues like this, both the center left and the center right have been unresponsive. They've been unaccountable. They've taken their voters largely for granted. And that means that what you can have, and you have an ideal situation, either for the rise of new populist parties, which is what happens in East Central Europe, or for the kind of a hostile takeover of existing parties by sort of populist authoritarian leaders, which is what happened in the United States, in Israel, and to a large extent in India as well. And I think in those situations, you basically have sort of, substantial minorities of the electorate who are supportive of leaders who basically have no commitment to democracy and all the commitments to their own advancement to power. And if that means destroying democracy, they're all too happy to do it. And the center left and the center right, these mainstream parties, are basically unable to answer this, and they're basically unable to respond to this in a way that would satisfy the electorate. Because for too long, they were the ones who took the voters for granted, wouldn't respond to their concerns, and basically sort of told the voters that there is no alternative.
So Lenka, I think your work speaks to this. I mean, what I take from your wonderful book on the rise of the right, basically that you argue that part of what makes the right rise is the fact that certain minorities are given more rights. And this is sort of, when you take it back, a kind of a depressing argument, which is that, sort of, for example, that in the United States, which, the argument is about Europe, it really seems to sort of resonate very much in the United States, that many people have argued that part of the reason for the rise of populism in the United States has to do with the election of Barack Obama as president. I mean, so do you see that as I mean, can you just talk about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I just want to say that the book is a medium-term theory. In the long run, I hope truth and love prevails. And I do believe that, like, in the long run, we can all get along and democracy wins. However, in the medium theory, as you sort of pointed out rightly, it's a reactive theory that basically attributes surges in voting for the radical right parties to policies of minority accommodation and changes. It's a sort of form of a policy backlash, sort of changing the status quo between minority and politicized minorities and majorities. And recently I have been, and so most of the book is about voting for ethnic parties and ethnic accommodation. And I sort of feel comfortable with that argument. However, I'm trying to expand the argument to perhaps some other areas of social conservatism, sort of LGBT rights, whether, the theory will travel as well. But I think one thing that the book tries to really highlight is to focus on minorities that seek rights and are politicized. And sort of the color of the book is that if minorities don't want things, for example, in the United States, most of Arizona are Native Americans, they in fact don't want stuff. So you don't see any sort of politicization of their rights, which in a way is quite crazy when you think about it. But it sort of draws attention to the fact that not all minorities create this backlash, and they have to, sort of come out of closet, demand things, want things, and then you sort of at least in the medium term you expect a pushback. But I also would like to highlight that we have seen in countries, for example, in Slovakia, that a lot of the majority-minority issues are being resolved. So I think this is a dynamic process. In the long run, accommodation and some reasonable status quo can be achieved, but in the long run, you will always pay a price for it. And we should just have an honest debate about the trades-off of, affirmative action, minority accommodation, and expect reaction. Yeah, thank you. And I also just would like to shout out that since Shusha mentioned that Anna's book titles are great, Anna actually came out with the title of the book. So I want to thank her in this public forum. Yeah.
Your influences. So I guess next I want to talk about one of the kind of what many see as the sort of culprit of some of the backsliding to the extent that it exists. And this is asked by the audience, which is about the role of social media. I mean, so how much of a role do you see? I mean, how important is the social media, or there sort of, deeper, sort of more structural forces or is the social media simply reflective of society the way it is? Jump in on that.
Yeah, I think social media is an accelerant, but it's not a cause. It's certainly not an independent cause. And I think there are two things to say about that. One is that, we've had conspiracy theories before, we've had sort of, vast polarization of politics before. It just happened more slowly. But the kind of sort of, demagogues that arose could get their message across with or without social media. The second thing to say is that, when you look at Twitter users, for example, the Twitter sphere is a very small one. It's a bunch of basically journalists yelling at each other, but the vast majority of Americans don't access it. The real action is taking place on Facebook, and that's much less public, and it's much more sort of, siloed into different groups. And here, Kate Starbird at UW has done fantastic research that shows that while all this stuff is seeded by Russia and other foreign actors, it's transmitted and sent on and truly developed by domestic ones. So it's not like, this is just a sort of fantastic conduit for Russian interference. This is also a medium in which domestic actors really sort of proliferate these messages and send them to their groups. And, as a follower of Red Facebook, I can tell you that the message get more and more arcane and more conspiratorial as time goes on. But again, this is the medium. It's not sort of the cause of the kind of polarization and conspiracy theories and siloing of public opinion that we see.
Anybody else? But break in here.
If you don't mind, Lucan, there is, and I agree with Anna on this, and especially it's nice to hear someone else citing Kate Starbird. Her work is really magnificent. But I think there is something else that's going on with social media and social media related technologies, which is, I think we focus a lot on the messages that are coming out, the way that they are communicating, vitriol. But I think there is also something going on in terms of the ability of human beings to organize relatively quickly and relatively widespread that we've seen emerging over the last 20 years. That's in some ways almost invisible. But the capacity of creating short-term, strong, if not durable institutions is shocking. And I think, if we look at it, Zsuzsa mentioned that virtual ASN is about to become one of the 3 pillars of ASN. And the idea that a virtual thing could be a pillar, first of all, is just a remarkable kind of metaphorical trick. But the idea that this kind of mechanism, the stuff that we're doing right now, was almost inconceivable 20 years ago. It suggests to me that there is another side to social media and websites and other kinds of online tech. And we just see, in the work that Tim Houghton and I have done on new political parties, the role of that kind of social media, that kind of organization has been transformative. Again, as Anna said, maybe not the instigator, but more than an accelerant.
Okay.
Let me just,
yes.
If I can briefly add, I think sort of there's also hand in hand with the rise of social media, there's a decline of mainstream media. And if you sort of look at the scores of media freedoms, if there is one indicator that is declining and really declining, it's media freedoms in a lot of countries. That has been a trend for some time due to commercial reasons and other reasons. And sort of another thing I think to consider is that the social media and sort of bypassing the traditional media is a great weapon in the hand of populists who basically seek this direct communication with voters. They want to bypass traditional parties, as Anna was saying, Kevin. They don't want to live with intermediate institutions. So this is a form of communication that serves them well. They use it frequently, and it's a weapon in their arsenal. But of course, it's not a cause, but it is a very useful thing in toolkit.
Okay, so I guess you have to leave a little early on, so I'm going to use this opportunity to push back on something you said. Have a little fun. So I understand what you're saying. It's sort of in some ways it's the medium, but doesn't timing matter? If it takes 2 years for a message to percolate in society versus a day, doesn't that actually have real world implications for outcomes? So isn't it sort of kind of underestimating the independent impact of social media to simply say it's a question of timing?
Well, I'm going to pull a Kevin and call your attention to the etymology of accelerant, right? That's exactly what it does. This is a social medium that basically takes things that would have taken 2 years, and now they take place in a matter of hours. The January 6th riot at the Capitol did not take months and years to plan. It was literally planned within a few weeks, thanks to social media, among other forces. So yeah, absolutely, it's an accelerant.
Okay. And so what about, let's talk a little bit about someone, I guess a couple of people mentioned uncivil society. Maybe Kevin, can you talk a little bit about what role does sort of uncivil society play? This is a question from the audience.
I mean, Michael Bernard's work on this is really nice, and I think this actually folds right back into the conversations that we've been having. As Anna and Lenka have said, there've always been these organizations. There's always been uncivil society, but it's been limited by its ability to be public, to reach out to audiences. Maybe in particular uncivil society, because it's composed of uncivil people who might not necessarily be those who would gather around particular things. These technologies of organization and communication may be asymmetrical in that regard. And so, I do think we've seen this, and I think it doesn't hurt that there are people out there who have a vested interest in accelerating that, a vested interest in helping to create that, and because the technology makes that kind of organization so much cheaper. I think groups like Russia and others, can use this. They can leverage a lot with very, very little expenditure. Politics in some ways is so incredibly cheap, and I think those, who would seek to, damage, undermine the politics in other countries, can use these kinds of mechanisms. It takes a little bit of startup money, but it doesn't take a lot. To take those existing elements, help to organize them, or give them something to cohere around, and throw a couple thousand bots at a problem, and see if you can make an existing bunch of guys who meet occasionally and live in their parents' basement and turn it into something really nationally threatening.
Great. So because you have to go, I'm just going to ask you a question, Anna. You raise a very important issue about the decline of informal institutions and sort of civility, especially, it's extremely obvious in US politics. So the question is, it's easy to see how this is destroyed. Is this basically permanent? Can you plausibly imagine a scenario where you rebuild these informal institutions? So in 2 minutes, can you describe how it's going to, that optimistic scenario?
Of course, and as Luca mentioned, I'd like to apologize. I'm going to have to leave early. But yeah, of course you can rebuild norms of civility, right? They arose in the first place. The question is fundamentally about an elite consensus. Informal norms don't rest on the power of state enforcement. They rest on the enforcement basically by consensus. And so if you have leaders who advocate, who basically argue that an election is illegitimate because they lost, if other elites basically dismiss this and ostracize that elite, that's an upholding of informal institutions. If, on the other hand, they coddle him and basically tell him that, oh, absolutely, there may have been problems, and now we need to have, and use it as an excuse to basically pass a passel of laws that are going to restrict access to voting, that's enabling that kind of erosion of informal institutions. And so it is fundamentally all comes down to what other elites are doing. And if other elites are willing to basically stand for democracy and stand for informal norms of toleration of opposition, of forbearance, of not going after your opponents this way, then they're restored. I think it's a very easy and straightforward issue. And of course, these informal institutions are easier to destroy. Look what happened when Trump in the United States basically declared the election illegitimate. Now suddenly, a sizable chunk of the electorate, and certainly most of the Republican Party, agrees that the 2020 election was illegitimate because their candidate lost. That's unprecedented. It's profoundly damaging, but the damage can be made up if Trump is silenced, marginalized, and ignored. But instead, he's being coddled and made into the de facto leader of the major opposition party in one of the oldest democracies in the world.
So you said informal norms can be rebuilt, but you don't sound very optimistic. So
no, I think.
Well, I don't disagree. You go. No, you go.
No, of course, what I'm saying is that they can be rebuilt, but it takes people to basically look beyond the tip of their nose and their short-term political gain. In the United States, at least, I agree with Mr. Levitsky that the Republican Party is now turning increasingly into a party that is concerned with maintaining its minority status as a governing party, and is willing to do whatever it takes to get there. And that means ignoring these norms. If future depended on having to uphold these norms, then we'd see them suddenly, singing Kumbaya with the rest of the political choir.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I really appreciate your participation.
Great, and my apologies. Thank you so much, everyone.
So Lenka, so you talk in your book about sort of, I think you do, about the role of the sort of gatekeeping function of parties in sort of, not deciding not to basically draw on these xenophobic appeals. So how do we build basically incentives for leaders basically to, these incentives have always been there, right? I mean, I think we can agree with the rise of Trump. One of the things this electorate was always quite racist, but it's only sort of, when someone discovered that you can really use that for electoral purposes. So how do you build incentives to sort of basically discourage racism by the mainstream parties?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I recall this very long time ago, I interviewed someone in charge of strategy in Social Democratic Party in the Czech Republic in the days when the Social Democrats were still a powerful, meaningful party. I mean, they are going to be dead in a few months. And the person told me that they did focus groups, and they could see that if they run on, anti-Roma rhetoric, it would resonate really well. But at that time, and this is a long time ago, the party leadership decided that they're just not going to do it because that's not what democratic parties do. So I think, there is a top-down and a bottom-up aspect of it, that you can have sensible political leadership for historical reasons, like in Germany, that will just say, we're not going to go there. Okay, so that's wishful thinking, but I do think there are responsible politicians like that. And I think another way to get away with it, even though it's a tricky, is really to force a competition from identity to economy. Of course, you can always taint economic competition with welfare chauvinism and identity-based appeals, but I think there is a way to really, if you refocus on purely economic issues, I think there is a way to sort of diminish the salience of identity. So one way is if parties, they're not converged, but they present sort of different economic policies. I'm not very optimistic, but I think that's in a way a bottom-up way to do this. But it's a tempting fruit.
Right. So one argument that Steve Fisher especially made is that part of the answer to this is basically answer the xenophobic appeals with another identity appeal, but one based on patriotism and sort of anti-treason. Do you think this is a solution? I mean, rather than sort of, one solution is to say, no, none of this identity stuff matters. It's all about, pocketbook. But is that?
Let me turn the tables and ask me, how do you think about Ukraine? I think, you know Ukraine much more than I do, but I think you do see sort of an issue where serious security issues trump some possibilities of mobilization on identity, even though there's a lot of scholarship that says sort of the Ukraine-Russian divide is usually in this traditional sense. So I think maybe Ukraine, out of all places, might be a case that is doing this quite well.
Yeah, although that doesn't seem to be a very optimistic story, because it's also, provided, it's injected fuel into the far right, which never had much of a presence in Ukraine, and it's still not dominant by any stretch of the imagination. Don't get angry at me, Ukrainian diaspora, but it wasn't at all a presence, 15, 20 years ago. Now it's a presence. So that's not very. You're not making me any more optimistic, Lenka. Sorry.
So I think in presence, I think in the presence of, let's say, serious security threats from big unnamed countries, I think there is a rally around the flag based on patriotism that can, that can suppress sort of the more like mundane identity politics. But I think these are exceptional circumstances. Like I thought naively that maybe the United States would be really upset about election meddling from foreign powers. Maybe there is hope for that, but we have seen where it there. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Yeah, even at this point, alien invasion would be interpreted differently by the two political parties in the United States. The Independence Day solution of everyone rallying around to fight the aliens, I think even that's off the table these days. Because when a major pandemic destroys your economy and your public health, and the two political parties have diametrically opposed positions on whether to put cloth on your face, I think it does raise questions that are fairly insoluble. At least they seem. I worry a little bit. We're getting into a diagnosis of the United States in a association dedicated to the study of nationalities more broadly. But in some ways, the U.S., at least at that broader level, seems to be one of the more worrying cases. We have a lot more optimistic news from Central Europe, actually, than we do from Arizona or Michigan.
Can you expand on that, Kevin?
I mean, I simply that, you know, and I was talking as I was prepping for today, talking to my co-author Tim about, you know, the majoritarian institutions in the United States that tend to create, you know, two sides for everything, and the degree to which now virtually every issue that pops up in the American kind of noosphere, you know, sort of immediately divides into one side or the other. And it's been really interesting to look at the countries of Central Europe, where, you know, fragmentation with parliamentary systems and multi-party systems is the rule. And, you know, a lot of people call attention to the problems with that kind of fragmentation, and they point to Weimar and, you know, suggest that these systems lead to eventually takeover or the end of democracy. But frankly, those weaker systems, those more fragmented systems, seem a lot more conducive to kind of ongoing, if messy, pluralism than systems like the US or like Hungary that consolidate institutionally, consolidate votes and power into just a few hands that might end up being on very, very different sides of core issues.
So I wanted to.
I don't know.
Okay, that's
okay. Go.
So I wanted to sort of lay out a sort of potential scenario, a sort of more I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I always have been. Where, you know, you've seen the rise of populism, which is really sort of anti-elitist and sort of takes advantage of, you know, as you've said in your new book, Kevin, you know, the sort of the corruption of the old elite. But eventually, you know, those people begin to forget what it was like under the old guys. And I mean, so could we imagine a scenario in which the populists basically, you know, blow their wad, and once they blow it, it sort of peters out, and we see a sort of a decline in populism and the sort of resurgence of more kind of mainstream parties? I mean, is that, you know, is there kind of a life? Are we sort of in the middle of a life cycle? I think so. Both Lenka, maybe Lenka, you could speak to this, or and then Kevin.
Yeah.
Lenka?
Yeah. So I think, you know, there are two issues. One is, and I'm going to put on like a very limited V4 hat. You have two populists in power in the Czech Republic and Slovakia that are constrained by fragmentation, even though it can also like enable things and coalition governments. And then you have two populists in power in Poland and Hungary that are not constrained by fragmentation, or at least especially in Hungary, so more majoritarian. And so it's a big difference whether the populists are in power or not. Once they are in power, boy, they can do things. And, you know, so I think a lot of what is, and we sort of talked about it in our prep for the session, a lot of stuff that's happening is revamping social welfare provision for voters and basically using the platform to buy off selected voters, put in sort of policies, and we see it in the Czech case as well, that, you know, target their supporters, and we see a lot of this in like policies of families or welfare provision, where you really create very strong incentives for voters, or through clientelism for voters to support you yet again. So they might not support you because of your beautiful anti-establishment message, you're in the establishment after all, but because they have economic and clientelistic, there's a sort of economic incentives to for these populists to stay in power.
So right, so you're painting a very pessimistic story where they, you know, they may arise in frustration out of the old elite, but they basically, once in power, institutionalize their rule and sort of.
I think, you know, I mean, a lot of it, what we talked about, depends on the institutions. For example, whether there are two chambers or not. Like in Poland, you know, there's a Senate that's really blocking. In Hungary, not. That's a big deal. Constitutional court, independent judiciary, these things are really important, whether they can rewrite sort of the electoral rules. But I think, and so that there are very serious institutional constraints. And then, of course, as you know, we're discussing their norms. But I think ultimately when they're in power, they have the power of the purse. And I think what we will see during the pandemic is that like budget prudence is out of the window. Nobody believes in it. So you see, of course, you see surges in spending, but some of it is really because of the pandemic, and some of it is really fast and spending, so you can get reelected. Like it's the oldest playbook on the planet, and that it, you know, it works with voters, of course.
Kevin?
Look, I think you put your finger really on the question that I'm most interested in the region, which is, we see this constant churn, this emergence of a consistent set of new political actors, and voters seem to accept it. And even when those actors don't behave well, and they opt for a set of new political actors, and then another new set after that, and another new set after that, the question I think is, can it settle back down? Can either newer parties learn how to stay stable, or will voters continue to be sort of fooled? I think Estonia offers a positive example, and there are some countries where you've had a lot of churn in the early 2000s that became more stable over time. I think the other countries where it's gotten more stable, it's gotten more stable in the wrong direction. I think the kind of stability that you see in Hungary isn't what you're really looking for overall. So Lenka's sort of description, I think, is one way that you restore kind of stability to the system at the expense of the democracy itself. And so you've got the one, you have stability restored without democracy or without much. Stability in Estonia sort of restored seemingly, relatively soundly, and then a series of unstable, constantly fluctuating electoral environments, which are better than better than the stable autocracy of Hungary, but are probably not what we were all looking for when we envisioned democracy in the region.
So I'm going to basically force you to end on an optimistic note, whether you like it or not, which is to talk about sort of, I think we all agree that, as bad as things have gotten in Europe and much of the world, things have not, electoralism is still alive. And I guess the question is, what are the main checks on a fuller, more serious move to authoritarianism? Is it simply protest? Is it the rule of law? I mean, what if you had to choose like one or two, or aren't there, or are there no checks? Or, is it simply sort of a free road? Is it the EU? Does it, the EU is weakened, but the question is, does the EU still kind of provide some, prevent Orban's hand when he's trying to arrest that journalist or shoot that independent journalist? What are the main checks? So maybe we'll start with you, Lenka, and then we'll end with Kevin, and I think then we'll have to sort of wrap it up.
So let me start with, I first giggled when you mentioned the EU, but actually there is an optimistic role, and that is the EU is maybe, or European Parliament maybe will force the European Commission to take corruption and abuse of funds seriously, and they just created a new institution that can be some sort of a stick to really check the flow of the European funds that are greatly stabilizing Orban's rule. So I think they have learned a lesson, and certainly if you turn off the faucet, that might help. I think I am a big believer in independent constitutional courts. We have seen that can really help, because once you want to change electoral rules and other sort of rules of the game, that's the formal aspect of it. I think there is hope in independent judiciary there. But I think, going back to the recent Freedom House course, you see that there is a surge in civic activism, liberal civic activism. And, again, Michael Bernhard, other people write about sort of different types of accountability. I think, and the Polish example of contestation shows us that, if there is a pushback, the populists can listen. But I think it has to be a pressure from the bottom through, not allowing to bend the rules, and from the top and from the bottom as well. And the EU certainly can really step it up a little bit.
Okay, great, thanks. Kevin, you have the last word, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I agree with Lenka, as I usually do, but the potential of the EU greater than the actual action of the EU suggests that there might be more work to be done there. The potential of constitutional courts, although coming from the United States, where when a constitutional court is in the wrong hands, it might be the reverse of the solution. For me, especially at the institutional level, it's proportional representation. And certain kinds of basic institutional engineering, staying away from majoritarian or pluralitarian systems, I think is really important. But I also agree with Lenka that at the grassroots level, I think there are two basic cultural shifts, and one is this emergence of technology, which often gets used or adapted by autocrats, but is still often able to produce surprises, that people are able to use technology in ways that autocrats might not necessarily expect. They're able to organize in ways that autocrats might not necessarily anticipate. And I think that's really important. And I think it's improved by the fact that the autocrats of today, unlike those of the past, really don't work very much with particular ideologies. I mean, they work with mentalities. They work with, you know, a certain set of kind of self-interested goals. But it does make those autocracies, I think, rather weak. And so, you know, while on the one hand we may not see the sort of emergence of consistently consolidated democracies that are never threatened, I also think we see that autocracies have holes in them that they didn't have back in the days when mastodons like us were starting to become drinking age. So that would be my source of opposition. It's not perfect, but I think the fragmentation and weirdness of the system, it constantly opens opportunities for change, and so that's where I would put my hope.
So if I may break in here, I think to me, what I find most implausible is that, you know, popular mobilization. I mean, I think popular mobilization for electoral rights is very plausible. I mean, people's candidate loses, you know, they get very angry and they want to go on the streets. But for free media, that is, you know, there, you know, the case of Hungary is indicative. You know, when he's, you know, managed to sort of change the editorial policy or shut down a media source, you know, there have been a few hundred people on the street, but no one's going to mobilize for an independent online news source. This is never going to happen. And so it does really raise the question of sort of what role, you know, sort of popular mobilization can play in sort of the liberal element, to the extent that I think we all agree we still want democracy not simply to be electoral, but to be liberal. It's hard to sort of see how that plays a role. I see, I see a role, I think, to me, the sort of, you know, we're talking not about the established West, but about the developing world. One of the biggest obstacles to, you know, reason why the election, you know, line is so high is because, and Kevin alluded to this, is that authoritarian leaders are themselves often quite weak. I mean, they're subject to the same forces. The same reason that Democrats often fail is the same reason that autocrats often fail. You know, they have weak states, you know, underpaid police, you know, weak parties that fragment, and sort of, and so that, you know, and opportunists who sort of take advantage of the rules to challenge, you know, dictators. I mean, we've seen this, you know, throughout Africa, you know, recently, you know, Malawi and until recently Benin and the like. So it's the weakness of dictators in some ways that sort of is one of the hopes of survival of electoralism. And also, I think the sort of the fact that I think that, you know, we're no longer in a world as in the 1930s, certainly, or even the 1960s, when you could engage in large scale violence and no one would know about it. And I think that really does sort of put a sort of, you know, hold the hand of the dictator who really wants to basically shut down an election. So, Kevin, you seemed to, you wanted to say something.
No, I was just nodding at what you said.
Oh, okay. Right. So I think that, you know, I think, you know, in a sense, what we have a situation here is in which it's really the same factors that are sort of preventing a further consolidation of democracy are also kind of preventing, you know, kind of a more serious move to sort of full scale dictatorship. So I don't know if we want to, are there any more questions? Maybe, do you want to, Lenka and Kevin, do you want to sort of say a last, you know, few words?
My environment has actually suddenly gotten quite noisy.
Okay.
And so I simply want to thank ASN and you especially for making this space available. And I'm glad that ASN's got a new pillar, and congratulations. I look forward to enjoying many, many more of these. And it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to all of you.
Great, thanks. Lenka?
Yeah, I am very optimistic in the long run. I think once you tasted freedom, it's a powerful thing, and people don't want to give it up easily, even though it's a difficult process. So, I think in the long run, I have hope, but again, in the short run, there is a lot to be studied. And I want to also thank you for the invitation, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I look forward to more of these panels and listening to other scholars discussing similar issues. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lucan and everyone. And I'm very happy that Lucan decided to ask our panelists to be optimistic, to say, say something uplifting. And I'm glad that they were able to do so. I like especially what Lenka said, that once you've tasted freedom, it's difficult to give it up. I'm also very happy that Kevin is still thinking that fragmentation can be a good thing. It's obviously it's obviously a question about where that sweet spot is between stability and fragmentation, but that's the thing. It's about balancing and what's that space, that place where both can be achieved somehow in a way that allows for pluralism. And so thank you so much. This is an excellent way, I think, to complete the first season of this third pillar of ASN, Virtual ASN. And we are going to be working in the background during the summer, and please stay tuned and also keep coming back to Virtual ASN. We have a second season planned already, and we will be posting information about that. We'll have public events and also member-only events. You will find information about all of that on the Virtual ASN website. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and see you back.
Thank you so much. This was a great opportunity. Thank you so much.
Gotcha.
See you.